You're watching Beyond Markets. Welcome, I'm Kenneth Igbomo, and on today's show, we'll explore ways to deepen ties between the United Kingdom and Nigeria as both countries launch an investment guide for British investors looking at Nigeria. Later on the show, the managing director of the W Hospitality Group speaks on the opportunities the expo in Dubai will present for the hospitality industry. You can join the conversation on social media. Let me know what you think about the topics we discuss. To do so, use the hashtag Beyond Markets and also send me a message on Twitter on my handle at Kenneth Igbomo. Now, the Nigerian Investment Promotion Commission and the UK Department for International Development launched the Nigerian Investment Guide on the sidelines of the recently concluded UK-Africa Investment Summit. CNBC Africa's Christy Cole discussed the wider implications of this with Kyari Bukar, the former chairman of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, and Andrew Nevin, the partner and chief economist at PwC Nigeria.
If one looks at it, there is that they first released their first WEO in October. So this is slightly lower than their initial predictions, globally speaking. But for Nigeria, I think it is no different from our own estimates. By our, I mean all the local analysts' estimates. The worst I have seen is around 2.2, and the best is around that 2.4, 2.5. So it is in line. However, Nigeria's growth is, our fortunes are tied to one single thing, which is oil price and production levels. And as the geopolitical issues come around, initially it was the US-China trade. Now it is US-Iran issues. Those and some of the other things going on may affect the price of crude oil. And depending on whose predictions you see, whether it is that of the World Bank or some other analysts like Goldman Sachs, it is anywhere from 63 to 65. Some even went as far as 68 per barrel on the average for 2020. So that may bode well for Nigeria. But then there are a few issues with the US, and those uncertainties might actually be an issue if it becomes that.
We'll definitely get to exhaust those issues during the course of our conversation. I'd like to very quickly bring in Andrew here. Between projections for Nigeria's economic outlook for 2020 by the IMF World Economic Outlook of a 2.5% and internal projections for Nigeria's growth at 2.4%, Andrew, what do you make of these numbers?
Well, to begin with, let's begin with the worldview. I mean, the world economy is slowing. It's not a big surprise. People point to short-term things like the US-China trade war, but the reality is outside of Africa, the demographics are very poor. The number of adults is not growing. The number of children is not growing. Economies are not going to grow, and we need to get used to that in Africa. And the only way to build Nigeria's economy is to build it here within Africa. We can't control the outside events. And obviously, we can't depend on high growth outside of Africa to drive Africa's growth. So Nigeria needs to control the economy and build itself.
So, Andrew, you speak of the global scale now, which, of course, brings to the four figures for global outlook as predicted by the IMF WEO at 3.3% for the globe, which is 0.1% lower than its October projections. Now, when we talk about the dynamics to consider for the world, we're looking at political unrest. There is the Iran-US dynamic. There's also the US-Beijing dynamics to consider. What dynamics will, differentiate in these projections by the IMF or will support the global economic growth in general? Kyari, shall we take your view?
Some level of global stabilization may actually be a factor in making that growth not as high as the earlier projections. But as the other thing is the demand side of things. Consumer spendings are, slowing down globally speaking, but in emerging markets, that's especially in the growth areas in emerging markets. Some countries with some certain growth sprouts in the last 2 or 3 years, one can see consumer demands going up. They're going into a higher income translating to higher demand, and that therefore translates to those growth. But globally speaking, I think the key things that have been highlighted by the report that had been issued is that India is going to slow down a bit, and the China demand on energy particularly, and some of their product minerals would also slow it down. Of course, the prediction for China is from 6.1 to 6.0. So 6.0 for any economy would be fantastic, but in the case of China, it is considered a slowdown. So.
Andrew, I'm looking more specific now at the sub-Saharan African figures from the IMF's WEO. For 2019, projections for SSA stand at 3.3%. For the next 2 years after that, 2020, 2021, we have growth pegged at 3.5%, which ranks sub-Saharan Africa only second place to the fastest growing economy in the world, which would be the emerging and developing Asia, which is pegged at 5.6, 5.8, and 5.9. That's like twice the difference, 2 times and over. What do you reckon should be Africa's sectors of interests going forward?
Well, we all know the problem with sub-Saharan growth. It's the giants of Africa that are lagging behind. So South Africa and Nigeria are doing poorly. We look at so many other countries on GDP measure, and they're doing very well, whether it's Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, obviously Rwanda, Kenya are all doing fine. In fact, given that the giants are lagging, it's amazing how well sub-Saharan Africa is doing. So the issue for us is how to get the 2 giants, Nigeria and South Africa, to come to the party. South Africa has its own issues. I think people are well aware of it. In Nigeria, of course, we need more investment. I mean, the biggest drawback here is we're getting only about half of the level of investment in Nigeria from both domestic and foreign sources to grow. We need to grow at 6 to 8%. So when we talk about 2.2, 2.3, some of the in a few years 3.5, none of that is good enough. If we want to lift 100 million people out of poverty, we need growth rates that are higher than 6%. And in fact, we had the central bank governor at the beginning of the year, as he entered his second term, say he wanted to see double-digit growth. And that's entirely possible. China's done it, and we can do it too if we get sufficient investment.
Double-digit growth. Kyari, how realistic is that for Nigeria?
It can only be done when we attract investments, if we become an attractive bride. And how you do that, there are some structural issues. One is rule of law. 2 is that we must be investor-friendly nation. Right now, those sort of calls are out. I mean, no one can make a definitive statement as to Nigeria's attractiveness vis-a-vis some of the other competing, if you will, African nations. So the attractiveness of Nigeria is, 1, demographics, 2, we need to ensure that there is ease of doing business, rule of law, and all of those are really needed to be demonstrated to the global investors such that they would be knocking on our doors. Rates are going down globally. T-bill rates, it's not just Nigeria, it's a global phenomenon. And so those funds would look for places that are attractive and that are inviting. And Nigeria ought to think about that and ensure that that is one of the top priorities of the federal government.
So talking about attracting investments and funding into the Nigerian economy, I'll take us very quickly to the UK Africa Investment Summit 2020, which is where Andrew is at the moment. At that summit, we have had a lot of statements come out, one of them mainly being that credited to the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who has said that he'd like UK to be the investment partner of choice for Africa. I say in whose interest or in which country's interest would this be, Andrew?
I think our position on this has been quite clear. Africa and Nigeria should be investment and business partners with everyone around the world. So there's a role for China, there's a role for India, there's a role for Europe, there's certainly a role for the UK. I applaud the UK's efforts in becoming business partners. Obviously, a lot of soft, strong ties, cultural ties, language, rule of the same legal system. Of course, football binds the nations together. So it's important that the UK comes there. But I was very heartened. Last night, I was with some Nigerian officials and some investors in Nigeria who've been there for, in some of the cases, decades. And we had a very constructive dialogue about it. I mean, there are investors who want to invest in Nigeria. And as Dr. Bukar says, if we make the environment a little bit easier, if state governors do what they have to do at their level, we're going to see a wave of investment come into Nigeria. Because the truth is, when you have negative interest rates in Europe, 1% interest rates in the U.S., people are not earning a return. In the right environment, they can earn much better returns in Nigeria. And if we do a few of the right things, we'll see the capital come in. But it's not just foreign capital Nigeria needs. We need to unlock domestic capital. And of course, domestic capital will also mean foreign capital is more comfortable. So that's how do our pension funds invest in the right kind of assets? How do ordinary Nigerians save and invest in the right kind of assets? But those two things together can really drive up how much is invested. But again, I really want to applaud the UK and Prime Minister Johnson for the efforts they're making to engage Africa.
So there are conversations, obviously, along the lines of this is good strategy for partnership between Africa and the UK, but there are also conversations following the lines of why are these strategic moves coming only when it's 2 weeks to the actual Brexit? Kyari, I'll come to you now. More importantly, what is a UK-Africa partnership to Africa at a time where Africa appears to be economically divided against itself? Talking about the ECO now and the AFCFTA, which has been said may not come into fruition on the July 1st, 2020 deadline.
Well, a few things, actually. One is the fact that you have to appreciate that Dr. Andrew is a Nigerian at heart. And the key thing is that I think Brexit is coming around the corner, and therefore UK has to do something. And I considered it strange that the investment summit itself was scheduled on the same day when WEF was opening up, World Economic Forum. So it is a way for UK to attract African heads of state versus allowing them to go to Davos.
Talk about strategy.
And it has worked. There is historical ties, there are emotional ties, especially for the former UK colonies. But when it comes to business and economics, the reality is that we have to look for it. It got to be a win-win situation. And for Nigeria ought to look at things from a pragmatic position. Of course, the issues that we're faced with, AFCTA, the ECO situation in our own sub-region, all of those have to be factored in, because this means that there is going to be a higher intra-Africa trade within our region and also across the continent. And that would actually bode well for us. Andrew mentioned that the capital need not be just external capital. It should also be a strategy of unlocking the internal capital as well. But the same can be said about the entire continent. So those initiatives would actually add to the velocity, if you will, of intra-Africa trade, which will actually lift all boats, sort of, in general terms. There are some strategic implications, though, which Nigeria ought to pay attention to and which Nigeria needs to embrace.